This lesson, we are going to be looking at JavaScript objects and how objects work within JavaScript. And they're very much like arrays. They give us the ability to hold multiple pieces of information. There's an example over at the Mozilla Developer Network where they've got an object as a person, and then they build out the person's properties. So person has a name, age, gender, interests. And then also with JavaScript objects, and this is one big difference between JSON and JavaScript objects. Within the JavaScript objects, we can run functions, but within JSON, it's just strictly for data. So we are going to be focusing on the data part of the JavaScript objects. So let's open up the editor and we're going to construct our own JavaScript object. So this is going to be a person, and a person will have multiple properties. They can have their first name, and they can also have a last name. So in order to construct an object, you use the colon to assign a value to the property. So this is going to be the property, and then each property can have a value. With JavaScript objects, you can also quote around the property name, and you don't have to. Within JSON, you do need to use the double quotes around the property name. So there is also, again, that slight difference between the JavaScript objects and JSON, where you don't have to quote around the property name, but you can also use property names that have spaces. And in this case, you do need to quote around it because with JavaScript, it doesn't handle spaces for the property names. So whether you're creating a property name, and if you are using one with spaces, then don't forget to quote around it. And it's always good practice if you want to keep and work with JSON, then to construct your JavaScript object just as it would be a valid JSON item. So let's set up a first name for this person. And also it can have multiple values. So it can also have a last name for the person. So set up a last name, and you could do this for yourself as well. So I'm just doing as an example, setting up my name. So first name, last name. And then also we can see here within the example at the Mozilla Developer Network that there are interests. So this is an array, and this allows us to have a combination of an object with an array and then make use of them together. So let's go ahead and we're going to select also one called interests. And arrays as well as objects are valid properties, values. So you can have an array and an object within an object, an array within an object within an array, and so forth. And we are going to have multiple examples coming up. So some of my interests might include JavaScript, of course, and I also might be interested in HTML. So let me add in another item in there. So HTML, and then also let's go ahead and add in CSS for cascading style sheets. So this constructs the object person, and in order to see that within the console, and the console is a really nice way to output object information as well as array information so that you can really see it output really nice and neatly. I'm going to move the dock at the bottom, and then let's open up the console. And it's giving me an error because it's not running the index file. So let's stop the live server, and then we'll open with the live server. So it looked like the live server had stopped. So now when I run the live server, the index file is running, and we see the object information here is being presented within the console. So there's the first name, there's the last name, and the interests. And the interests, just as we saw in the last lesson, because this is an array, it can hold multiple pieces of information, and then we can see them listed out. And arrays always have the same properties, so you can always get the length of the items contained within the array. So go ahead and create your own object. So create first name, last name, some interests, and you can include other property names. You can pause the video here or do it at the end of the lesson. So a few other things before we conclude this lesson about objects, and that's assigning and returning back values that are contained within the object. So this particular object, the object name is person, and we're already logging it out into the console. But if we want to get information that's contained within the person, we use the property name. So if we want to get the first name, we could specify the first name, and that's going to return back the associated value for first name. With objects, you can either use the dot notation, so that's the one that we're most familiar with doing with the person and dot first name, and you can also use the bracket notation. Now, oftentimes, if you are using more of a JSON type format, you might prefer to use the bracket notation because it does provide more flexibility within the property name. So in this case, when we list out person, I can't say person space first name, as this won't return back anything. This is going to return back an error. So it is the property name, but because there's a space, it's throwing an error. So if I do want to return back, I would use the bracket notation. And then within the bracket notation, I can specify the property name of first name, and then we get the right value being returned back. Now, common practice is not to include the spaces, but this is just something that you can be aware of. And in addition to that, there's also, with the bracket notation, you can make the values more flexible. So let's say, for instance, we have a value of x1, and I'll just equal x1 to the word 1, and then x2 will equal to the word 2. So because we are using the bracket notation, this provides us a more dynamic ability to interact with the values that are contained in there. So let's set a value for x and set it at 1 and output into the console using the bracket notation. So person and then bracket notation, we're going to output the value of x1. And also making this more dynamic, we're going to use the string value of x, and then we're going to concatenate whatever our current value of x is. So what do you think is going to be output here within the console log? Let's refresh it and we'll check it out. So it gets returned back the value of 1. So this, with the bracket notation, it provides us a more dynamic capability of outputting content that is contained within the object property names. So even if we do something like x1 plus plus, so that's going to increment it by 1, and the current value of x here is going to be 2. So x string value plus x number value of 2 is going to return back x2, and that's where we're able to see x plus the value of x is going to be equal to that right property name. So try it out, and we are going to be looping through and making more complex objects in the upcoming lesson. Challenge for this lesson: create an object, add some values into the object, use the bracket notation as well as the dot notation to return back the values of the object, add an array within the object, and return back the values that are contained within the array before you move on to the next lesson.